I write from the position of trying to see the world from the point of view of the character of the novel. The main character is Roddy Macrae. So I try to be inside his head as much as possible. Roddy commits some horrendous acts of violence, but I absolutely do not judge the character. And you can't, as a writer, try to second guess what readers will think of the character, because one reader will make one judgment, another reader will make another judgment. So I'm trying to write authentically from inside the character and present how they feel, and it's then up to a reader to make a judgment. My name's Graeme Macrae Burnet. I'm the author of His Bloody Project. I think the first idea for His Bloody Project really came to me about 30 years ago when I came across a book called I, Pierre Rivière, Having Slaughtered My Mother, Brother and Sister, which is a book about a true case in France in 1835. What was so remarkable about the case was that he then wrote a memoir in prison about the circumstances leading up to the murders, and I found this completely fascinating that this peasant had written this account, which is actually quite articulate and interesting, and there's such a contrast between that and the incredible violence of his acts. The dossier, these are the various documents that really make up the structure of the book, and which to some extent are mirrored in His Bloody Project, even down to the trial. So that was kind of the germ of the idea for His Bloody Project, that it was going to be a novel about somebody who commits a murder and writes a memoir about it, and it was going to be told as a series of documents. And initially I had a more radical idea that the documents would be presented in a way that you could read in any order. As I wrote the book, it evolved into something, the materials presented quite chronologically, so it reads much more like a conventional novel than I maybe had in mind at the beginning. But I think that always happens when you're writing a novel. What you end up with isn't necessarily what you conceived of at the beginning. One of the longest scenes in the book, Roddy gets a job assisting in a deer stalking party. Yeah, we've just got an early draft, which is kind of remarkably fluent, actually. It goes on for pages and pages. But I think the shape of the scene is as it ends up in the book. Yes, in this original draft, it ends a lot more violently than it does in the book. I think quite often I write something quite dramatic and then reel it back in later drafts. My writing routine, I try to treat it like a job, like a 9-to-5 job. I never start at 9 o'clock, of course, but I go to the Mitchell Library, which is about a 10-minute walk from my flat here. I like to feel like I'm going to work. Then when I leave the library, I can kind of leave it behind. Writing a novel is a job. It takes a long time, and I treat it like a job. His Bloody Project was my second novel. My first novel, The Disappearance of Adele Badeau, which is a kind of crime novel set in a small French town. I think we refer to it as a cult hit, which means it didn't sell very many copies. So I was very far away from being a full-time writer at that point, and I won a Scottish Book Trust New Writers Award, which was a really big deal for me at the time. But I think, you can only write the books that you want to write, and I was very lucky to have a very supportive publisher in Saraband who didn't mind that I was writing something very, very different from my first novel. These are two of the notebooks I used for when I was doing my research, and they're very chaotically organised. Sometimes sort of things photocopied. These are pages from the statistical accounts of Scotland, which were a sort of sociological record written by the parish ministers of each parish. And here in the parish of Applecross, this is from 1840, it was written by the local minister at the time, who by complete coincidence was called the Reverend Roderick Macrae. I'd actually worked as a researcher for some TV documentary series, so I had quite a good background in doing that kind of stuff and using archives and getting a bit beyond the first page of Google. I was particularly excited by the research I did in the National Archive of Scotland in Edinburgh. And there you can get the documents actually relating to old 19th century murder cases. So you can read psychiatric reports, you can read the post-mortem reports, and you can read the witness statements relating to a case. And this is actually the structure of my book. Any one of those bundles of documents you could take and make a novel from. They're so suggestive, and you feel the characters and situation. There was another key document I came across in a book, which was just a list of regulations that the crofters lived under. Incredibly specific. Whether they could own a dog or not, and stipulations that the crofters could not take the shellfish from the shore, the fish from the burns, the heather from the hillside, and the seaware, crucially, the seaware from the shore, the seaweed, because all these were the property of the laird. The tenants shall not take away any seaware except from such parts of the shore as shall be attached to each township, and they shall take it therefrom, and only at such times and in such proportions as shall be prescribed from time to time by the factor or ground officer, and none are to frequent the shores in quest of seaware except when the constables are present. So this little part of this document, became one of the most memorable scenes in the book, when Roddy and his father are taking seaware to fertilise their crops, and Lachlan Mackenzie demands that they put it back because they haven't asked the proper permission. Almost every incident in the book came out of the research, and the research really formed the narrative of the story, because I found out about these kind of power structures that existed at the time, the sort of feudal nature of the social system, and the conditions that crofters lived under at that time. We're talking mid-19th century. Were really primitive. People living in black houses, sharing houses with their livestock in the winter. No chimney, so the smoke would just seep out through the roof of the house. So terrible, terrible conditions. And I felt quite angry sometimes reading that stuff, and that totally informed the book, because I hadn't planned the narrative, so I was able to incorporate it into the story. I visited the Highland Folk Museum at Newton Moor, maybe halfway through writing the book, and it's a tremendous place. It was actually, I think, started by Isabel Grant, who wrote the most important book on the kind of lifestyle of Highland people, called Highland Folkways, which was a really important book in my research. And the Folk Museum is a really fantastic place, because you can actually walk into an old black house, and to some extent you can maybe try to feel the atmosphere of what it might have been like to live in a place like that. You also have the tools which form a very important part in the story, because they're the weapons that Roddy uses to commit his murders. Here we have a flotter, this kind of pointed spade, and this rather brutal croman or croman, which Roddy takes to Lachlan Mackenzie's house. The cashchrum, which features in the book as well, which was a kind of primitive foot plough. I think the extended period of research I did at the beginning, it gave me the confidence that I could write about this world, but it can't determine exactly how you write about it, because at the end of the day, you are writing a novel. It's not an academic work with footnotes, but what's crucial is that the reader feels that the world is authentic. You're building an authentic world for the reader. And because it's in a documentary form, that's really important, that there aren't errors that kind of snap people out of the fictional world of the book. And the fact is, a very large proportion of readers have believed the book to be a true crime book and to be made up of actual documents. And I kind of take that as a sort of compliment to the writing. When I was doing my research from the very beginning, I wanted to keep a note of the kind of vocabulary that Roddy would use in his account. So I just wrote down a list of words for sort of various, especially concrete nouns. So we've got things like, bannock, quite a familiar word for an oatcake. Stirk, which is a young cow. Yeld and yin. These are all words for livestock, words that Roddy would have been familiar with. Stroopach, which is a brew of tea, which was a word my granny would have used. Phrases like the black months and the yellow months for winter and summer. So all these words I used to inform Roddy's narrative and give it what I hope was the right texture. Here we have this phrase, the sort of proverb, the cairn performs best after the grindstone has been pitted, which became the epigraph of the novel. But the working title of the book was The Cairn Performs Best, which has a sort of poetic feel, but was never going to work as a title because nobody, for a start, knows what a cairn is, including myself at the time. It's a kind of millstone. Roddy Macrae does indeed share my surname or my middle name. And the reason for that is really quite simple, that I wanted to present the book as a series of documents, and the story I came up with was that I was researching my own grandfather, Donald Macrae, who really was my grandfather, who was born in Applecross. And it seemed if I was in an archive, I would come across documents relating to somebody with the same surname because they would be alphabetically there. In a way, it's showing my ties to that area. And my mother's from Lochcarron, which is a neighbouring village. And in that area, a very large proportion of people are either called Macrae or Mackenzie. It was very important for me, especially sort of coming from the area, to make sure it was as accurate as possible. And you can go there now, you will find Kildue. Obviously the houses are more modern, but it's pretty much exactly as described in the book. Erdu, across the bay. You can walk to Applecross, and the big house, which is still there, which features in the book. There's the burn, where an incident between Roddy and Flora Mackenzie takes place. It's all there. It's all completely accurate. And during the writing of the book, I paid several visits. When I would walk around Kildue, I walked up the hill behind Kildue and looked down on the village, you know, as Roddy does. And this is all in service of, to some extent, trying to inhabit the mind of the character, to see, you know, if I'm describing how it is to look down on this village from above, I have the opportunity to go and do that. So there is a sort of minor tourist trail now where people, because of the book, go up to Applecross and, you know, walk around, and they walk from one end of Kildue to the other in imitation of Roddy's doing his walk to commit his murders, which I think is perhaps a little bit annoying for people who live in Kildue, who I perhaps owe an apology to. But it's really thrilling for me that it's taken people to the area. I wrote Roddy's memoir entirely separately, and I wrote it first because I knew it was the most important part of the book. And then I took a kind of break and did some of the research for the sort of psychiatric sections of the book. James Bruce Thompson, the psychiatrist character in the book, he wrote 2 articles which you can, with a bit of effort, find on the internet. So again, I could take the vocabulary that he used and in some cases paraphrase or directly quote from those articles to find his voice. And then the trial I wrote at the end, and I wrote the trial, I kind of knew how it would end, but even as I was writing it, I'm going to the Mitchell Library on a daily basis, and there's like sort of little twists and turns in the trial. And I remember going in one day feeling like, oh, all is lost. And then I started writing again. I'm like, no, maybe it isn't. You know, I'm actually following the drama of the trial myself as a writer. The book took off very specifically on a day in July when I was at the time working, in order to make money to support myself as a writer. I was working as a painter and decorator, and I was working, doing a job down in Kilmarnock, my hometown, and I got a phone call from Sarah Hunt, my publisher, telling me that his bloody project had been longlisted for the Booker Prize. And 20 minutes later, I'm on the phone to the literary editor of The Guardian, who was not in the habit of phoning me. And the book, even in the long list stage, it got a lot of press. Because it was deemed to be something of a surprise that a crime novel was on the Booker long list, and also because of the fact that Sarabande is, you know, a small independent publisher. When the book made the shortlist of the Booker Prize and outsold all the other books on the shortlist, you know, it seemed like, okay, this is doing quite well. And you know, the other thing that the Booker Prize does is it gathers interest from publishers around the world. So immediately there were offers of publication in Australia, France, Italy. So yeah, that was a big transformative moment, absolutely. The book is now in Chinese, for example, with this absolutely stunning but very weird cover. It's a very strange representation of the Highlands of Scotland. This is Farsi, Iranian edition. Most recently I was in Korea, and this is the Korean edition, which is a beautifully designed book, and really interesting to see how different cultures interpret the book and present it to a completely different audience. This beautiful one, similar cover to the original, it's Romanian. So yeah, the book has very much transcended anything I could have imagined when I wrote it in the Mitchell Library. Any novel is a success or not because of its characters. And I think novels require characters that people care about, and somehow people relate or they feel something for the character of Roddy Macrae, whether they love him or hate him, or they're rooting for him or they're not rooting for him. They feel something, and the character draws people into the book. I think in terms of how the books succeeded abroad, I think it taps into, completely unintentionally on my part, it taps into this idea of power structures and how people in a certain situation don't have access to power. And Roddy and his father are powerless people, and the people who live in the big house, they set the rules, the regulations, and they enforce the regulations. So people translate these ideas into situations from their own country. People find some resonance in that. But I wrote a novel about a village in Scotland in 1869, and that's what I wanted to write about. And I think for me that's the right way to go about things, to start from a very specific situation rather than to attempt to comment generally about something beyond that situation. So I think that's kind of how people have managed to relate to what is a book about a village in Scotland in 1869.